Building your own hooks. Extract component logic into reusable functions. Okay, so hooks are a new addition in React 16.8, and they let you state and other React features without writing a class. So before using React hooks, we used to write classes, but now we don't need to write React classes, and we can write simple functions and hooks, and a combination of functions and hooks. We can use hooks inside the functions, and we don't need to write a class. So instead of having a state inside a class, we can just use the use reducer or useState hook. So let's have a look at this example. Like here, we are importing React and useState from React library. And here we can see that we do not have any class at all. What we have here instead of class and state is that we are using useState hook and initializing the state with 0 directly. If we would use a class, then we would have state inside the class. This start state is equal to the object, and then inside we have a property count, and we initialize it with 0. But in hooks, we just write directly the useState hook, which we have imported over here from the package React. And then this method setCount is used to update the state, whereas the property count is here, and we can use it freely inside here. Like inside in this function, which is called handle button click, we are updating the state by calling the method setCount and then passing the property count, getting the value of count and adding 1 to it, and then setting and updating the value of count. So this is how we used to write when we were using class, but this is how we are using the useState hook now when we are not using classes and we are using hooks. So let's go to the next one. When we want to share logic between two JavaScript functions, we extract it to a third function. So we, instead of repeating those lines of code and that logic in both the functions, we just extract it to a third function. And then we call that third function in both those two functions where they are needed. But we just write one line to call that function, the third function that we have written here. So both components and hooks are functions, so they work. This works for them too. A custom hook is a JavaScript function whose name starts with use, and they may call other hooks, and they may call other hooks. Let's write a custom hook, useDropDown, as we have said above, that we have to begin the hook with use. Therefore, we will also begin the name of our hook with useDropDown, that could be used to make drop-down boxes. We might need different drop-down boxes. For example, you might be using one drop-down box on the login form. You might need one on the contact pages, or maybe on about pages, or somewhere else where you have to write addresses. So you can just write one hook useDropDown and then call that useDropDown just like you do a function, and you can create drop-down boxes wherever you need. Whenever we need a drop-down box in our app, we can just use this hook. So here is our project. Let's run our project, and before writing new code, let's see what was the output of our code that we had after writing code in our last lecture. So this was the output of our last video. We could get data from the API, and we could see the number of infected people, the number of recovered people, and the number of deaths from COVID-19. But we do not have information about individual countries, because these are worldwide infected and worldwide recovered and worldwide deaths. So now we are going to write a hook, as we said earlier, a useDropDown hook. And that hook will be used in our project to make a drop down here, and the user would be able to select a country from that drop down box, and changing the country into that drop down box will cause this data will get changed, and we will fetch fresh data from the API, and that data will represent the number of infected people, recovered people, and the number of deaths for that country that the user has chosen in the drop-down box. So let's start by making a new folder inside the components folder and name it drop-down box. And inside that folder, we are going to make a new file, new module, drop-down maker.jsx. And we will also make a CSS file, drop down CSS. So let's write the CSS first. Dot form control. We'll just write the width 30% and margin bottom to be 30 pixels and not important. We'll just save the file and import it inside the drop-down maker. We can just import it here. Import styles from dropdown.css. Besides the CSS, we need to import React. We need useState hook from package React. We also need to import from material UI core, and we are going to import native select and form control. So let's comment our file to make it easy for the readers. The purpose of this module is making a custom hook that could be used to create drop-down boxes. So const useDropDown export default useDropDown. So this function useDropDown, which is a hook that we are going to write, will be used in our app for creating drop-down boxes, and therefore we need to export it over here. Well, this function will need a label. Like every drop-down box has a label. It must have a default state, and it must have some kind of options. Okay, we will explain and comment what are these three arguments that this function is going to take. Label is the name of the drop-down. For example, if you want to make a drop-down box for country so that the user could select a country from that drop-down box, so the label could be a country. Okay. Default state represents the default state of the hook. For example, Oh, I have to write it as a comment of the hook. For example, if we have a country and then we have set country and we use this useState like that, so here the default state is needed, and that default state could be any country, or you could just give it like you are starting with no country at all, but you are initializing here. So this is the default state, which is just an empty string. So we are actually initializing our hook, useState hook, with an empty string, which means that the country has not been set, or it has been set with an empty string. But we can use this function setCountry later on to update the value of this country inside the hook. So what is the options? The options, it will be an array, and in case of drop down is usually an iterable. For example, a list of countries, a list of provinces, etc. So we can pass here these options as an array or any iterable. We can pass an array of countries. In this application, we are going to fetch this array of countries from our API. As you can see, you might have seen in our previous video, in one of our previous videos, that we are getting a list of countries from an API. So that array will be passed here as options to this useDropDown hook to make a dropdown for us, and this dropdown box will be populated from that array which we fetch from the API. Okay, now here we can write country, set country, and then we start our hook and we initialize it with an empty string. Here we have a function that doesn't take any arguments, and the function is called dropDown maker. So here we have imported form control and native select from material UI code, and we are going to use them over here. So let's start with form control. So we'll be giving a class name, and the class name is styles.formControl. This is the one that we have imported here above, form control from material UI dashboard. So this is styles. This is the one that we have written here in dropdown.css.formControl. So styles.formControl. And inside we are going to write a label for the dropdown, and this label we can write HTML4, and we set it to the label, this label that we have here. So if we pass it a country, for example, here, so the label of this dropdown will be a country. If we pass it, for example, telephone codes, because we have telephone codes in the dropdown, then this label will represent telephone codes. Okay, here we have to write the label. So now we have a label for our dropdown box, Now we need to use the native select that we have imported here from the material UI core library. And this native select, we are going to pass it here, ID. We will pass the label as ID. It must have a value, and that value will be state. This one. List the state. Okay, we wrote here country and set country just for the sake of explanation. But since we are making a hook, and that hook will be used for creating different drop-down boxes. So we cannot write here country. We should write a general term like state, and this should be set state. Now, if we pass it here a country in the label, so this will be country, and then we will have a set country. But if it's telephone code, then it will be telephone code and set telephone code. If you pass it like province, so this will be province and this will be set province. And that value state is going to be here, value state. Now on change, this is the function that will be called when the user selects a different country from the drop-down box. So set state. So we are calling this updated function for this hook, useState hook, set state, and we will be passing e.target.value, which in our case of country drop-down box will be the country, like India or Sweden or Germany. That Germany would go here, or India would go here to this set state, and then we can get the state from there. And we can set the disabled if options length is not true. So the arrays that we are passing it, the arrays of country that has no country at all, if the array's length is not true, then should be disabled. The drop-down box should be disabled. Okay, so this was native select and okay. Now inside we are going to write option, the first option, and we want the first option to show global. We want to show data, like we already are doing here, data for the number of deaths and number of recovered and number of infected for the whole world. And for that, we are going to show here this option, global. And after that, we want to show all the other options. So for that, we will write, this is our array of options. It was passed to this use drop-down hook here. We are going to map over that and get one item at a time. And we are going to make options out of that. And each option is going to have a key. And each option is going to have a value when it is selected by the user. It's going to be the item as well. And then we are going to show the item here as well, so that the user can see it. So when we map over this, we have a list of items. All the countries will be shown to the user, and whichever is selected by the user, the key and the value will go over here. So now that we have a form control, let's return an array where we send back the state, we send the drop-down maker, and we send the set state. So state and set state, these are here, state and set state, useState hook. So we are sending this function which will enable the user to select a country, and then this updater function will be called to update this state, and from that state we can get the latest state. And this is this drop-down function that we are sending back. So this array will be returned to the caller of this hook, and then we are exporting over here. So this is our useDropDown hook that we have written to produce drop-downs in our app, and this will enable us to just write one line of code to call this useDropDown box, just like we are doing useState over here. Just like using the useState here, we can use the useDropDown, and that will enable us to use this hook in different places in our apps, in this app, and we can use this drop-down to produce as many drop-downs as we need. Now that our hook is ready, let's use it in our app.js file. So we go to our app.js and import the hook over here. Import useDropDown from /components. Inside the components, it's in the drop-down box, and then we have drop-down maker. So here, when we are where we are returning the COVID cards, which are shown over there, as you can see over here. Now we can't see it, but you used to see here 3 cards. So we want to have the drop-down box here. So let's use the country drop down over here. Okay, and this component country drop down, we need to make it because we are using it, we are composing it inside the app.js component, but we don't have this component. So we are going to make this component using our hook, useDropDown. So let's make the hook. So here inside our function app, we already have data, set data, and useState. We can just delete this and we can make a new hook here. useDropDown, and we are going to pass it, as we have seen here. The first is label. We are going to pass it a label. So let's pass it a label. Select a country. We want a colon and we want a space. The next one is default state and options. For default state, we are going to send an empty string, and for options, we need to pass it a country list. And this useDropDown hook, it will give us country and country drop-down. And that country drop-down has been composed here. So now we need to pass it a country list. We don't have a country list over here, but we can get one because we have already written a function here in our API folder, inside our source folder in our API folder, we have this index.js where we have a function here, fetch countries data, and we can use this function to get countries. So we can import that one over here, fetch countries data, and now we can use this inside the useEffect hook to get a list of countries. So let's get a list of the countries. Get a list of countries on the API. We will initialize with an empty array. So initially we don't have any country at all, and that is why we are initializing the state with an empty array. And once we use the hook, so we have access to country list, and then we have an updater function, set country list. So this country list, that is what we are going to pass here. Country list, a list of the countries, because this function is going to give us an array. So now we need to fetch those countries from the API, and for that we are going to use useEffect hook. And this useEffect hook we have imported here from the React package. So we will be using this useEffect. Okay, we have already used effect in the API part of our app, but just to revise things, what is an effect hook? Okay, a useEffect hook. This is an example of a useEffect hook, a network request. For example, if we are going to an API and getting some data from the user, or we are sending a login request or a sign up request to the server. These are all examples of a network request. Okay, like if you are causing some logs, writing some logs to the server, you are writing some data to the cache, you are updating the cache. So these are all examples of things that are outside the scope of the function being executed. So all sorts of effects that are outside the scope of the function being executed, they have some side effect. They have side effects because they are not pure functions. Here is a definition of pure functions. Pure functions are deterministic. This means that given an input, they always return the same output. So that doesn't mean that all pure functions have side effects. Generating a random value within a function makes it impure, but it isn't a side effect. For example, if you have a function and that function uses some random numbers and you are using another function, or you are generating random functions inside that function, so that random number has been used inside this function. This makes the function impure because you are violating the definition of pure function, because pure functions should be deterministic. Generating a random number is not deterministic because the random number generator gives you a different random number each time you run that function. So this is not a deterministic. That means that using a random number generator inside your functions make your function impure. But this does not mean that it has a side effect. It has no side effect. Because they are outside. The definition of side effects is that all sorts of effects that are outside the scope of function being executed. But here, the effects of this random number generation affects things only inside your function. It does not affect things outside this function. So your function is not pivot, it is impivot, but it has no side effects. So we use this hook, useEffect hook, in such situation where things have got side effects. Since we are fetching the list of the countries from an API, and a lot of things can happen. There could be server could be down, there could be some gateway error. Therefore, to avoid such side effects, we are using useEffect hook. So the effect hook lets you perform side effects in function components. So we use the useEffect hook because it lets you perform side effects in function components. And a side effect is anything that affects something outside the scope of the function being executed. So here we are going to use useEffect. So let's see if we have, yes, we have imported which country's data over here. So we will come over here and we will make a constant. Let's name this as fetch countries from API. This will be an async function, asynchronous. And we will call this updater of our useState hook set country list over here. And we have to await here. And then we use fetch countries data, which we have already written in the and imported over here, fetch countries data. This will give us an array. Let's see it here. We have here in the API, this is the function, and this function, fetch countries data, it will return an array. We are mapping over it, so this will produce an array, and this will give us returning an array of country names. So that array, we are passing that array here to the set country list, which is then updated to this useState function, and we will get a list of all the countries, and that country list will be passed to our customized hook useDropDown over here, and that will make a drop-down box for us. Okay, now what we are going to do is deleting the old stuff. Now we are going to get COVID-19 data from the API endpoint with this component is loading. Okay, let's write that portion first. Since we are getting this data also from the server, from our API endpoint, this means that we need a useEffect hook. Const get from API. This will be async. We need to pass the country. We will call our updated function setData. This is our updated function over here, data setData, useState function. Okay, so await fetch COVID data, and we will pass the country. This is the function fetch COVID data, which we have imported from our API, and we can see here the function once again. So this is the function fetch countries data, and this is the function fetch COVID data. This gets a country, If we have a country, then we have this URL. If we don't have a country, then we have the original URL, which is the base URL. And this is the base URL of our API endpoint. But if we have a country here, so then we change the URL from the base URL to this URL, because we need to add the country so that we could get data about the infected and the number of recovered people and the number of deaths for this particular country. So here, as you can see, that we have a try catch and we are returning an object with confirmed recovered deaths and last update. So we are returning this object actually from this function. So that is why, since we are returning an object over here, therefore we are initializing this data set data, this useState function with an empty object. Okay. Now calling this updater set data, we are getting fetch COVID data for this particular country, and then we set it here. Okay. Now we need to call this function. So we can call it here, get from API, and we need to pass it a country over here. So we need to pass it a country, and this is the country that our user will select from the drop-down box, this country, and that country will be passed to get from API, and we will fetch data related to that country over here in this hook. Now, since we have written here that we want to get this data with the component is loading or unloading, and for that we need to pass it here an array, an empty array. If present, effect will only activate if the values in the list change. So we have, at the moment, we have no values over here. But if we write here a country, that means if present, effect will only activate if the values in the list change. So if the value of this country changes, this means that fresh data, this useEffect will be fired and this component will be rendered, showing, displaying. Whenever this component is rendered, it will fetch fresh data from the API endpoint for this particular country and re-render the component. Okay, so now we have written our component and we have composed country drop down. We are making country drop down component here using our useDropDown. We are passing the label, default status, and country list here to the useDropDown. So here, here we have Mr. T, default state. Here is our options. So okay, here we have a problem. This is not capital O. So and another problem here is that we have to pass this default state to our useState. So for the first time it is an empty string, as we can see here, but later on this will not be empty when the user will be selecting a new country. So here is all the changes that we needed to make. This was our drop-down, useDropDown hook that makes drop-downs for us. And this is our app.js, where we are importing the useDropDown and we are making a new drop-down over here. And this data that we are fetching from the API, this will, when the component is loading, unloading, or when the country changes, because we are passing country over here. Therefore, whenever the country changes, this component will re-render displaying the new data fetched for that particular country, which will be updated using the updater function setData, and then we can get the fresh data from there, passing that data over here to the COVID cards. So the country drop-down component will just help us display a drop-down box which the user will use to select a new country. Once the value of the country is changed, new data is fetched for that particular country, and using the updater function setData, data is set here in this using this setData function. Then we have the new data available over here, and that new data will be passed as a props to the COVID cards function. And that COVID cards function we have already written in one of our previous videos here. This is the COVID card function. We are using card context typography, which we have imported from material library over here. Okay, so we have another problem here in the dropdown maker.jx file, that the class name is not in double quotes. So this is in angle brackets. Let's check if we have some other. Okay, so let's see the output. Okay, here we can see that there is a problem. Select a country, we have a drop-down box. We can see the option globe, but we cannot select a country. So let's check our code. So here we are initializing it with an empty object. Here we are fetching a list of countries from the API. Okay, here we need to pass it an empty array so that data is loaded. useEffect will be called, and this component will be rendered when loading or unloading the component. Another problem is that we have written the function, but we are not calling the function. This fetch countries from API. It's not fetching any countries, and that is why we don't have any countries over here, because those countries are not fetched at all. They are fetched over here. They will be fetched if we call this function. So let's call this function fetch countries from API here. And now when we are calling this function will be executed, and a list of countries will be brought from the API. They will be fetched from API, and then our updater function will set the state, and we will get a list of countries, country list, which will be passed over here. So actually the problem was that we wrote the function, but we didn't call the function, we didn't execute the function, so we couldn't get a list of the countries. So now we have a list of countries, and if we take Australia, so it should show the number of deaths in Australia, the number of recovered in Australia, and the number of infected in Australia. If we select Brazil, we can see data, the number of deaths in Brazil, recovered and infected. Let's see US, for example. The number of deaths in the US, the number of recovered in the US, and the number of infected people in the US. There is one problem in our app. If we select the global, so we get this loading status and we don't get any data. And this is because if we go to we can just search over here loading, and we can see here that our file card.jsx over here, the props that we get, the COVID cards is getting props, and we are destructuring here data, and then we are destructuring here confirmed, recovered, deaths, and last update. So here, if the confirmed is not true, so we just return loading, which means that we didn't get any data. So that is why we don't have any confirmed, recovered, or deaths or last update. They are null. So here we can have a check that if the country passed is global, then show data for all the countries. But if the country passing is not global, then show data for that particular country. But this reminds us that there is another problem in our useDropDown maker, or in our custom hook, that it is not general actually, and we need to make it general. Here we are passing global here, but in all dropdowns, the first option is not global. Maybe somebody would like to have it all, so that the user can select all and all data is shown. It could be something different. So we don't have to write global or all over here in our hook, because this hook is a custom hook that is used for making drop-down boxes. So it should be general. So a better solution would be, there could be many solutions. One solution that comes in our mind is that we can pass the first option here that we show here, like global or all here, like let's say first option. So whenever we are using this use drop-down custom over here, so we can pass it here, first option, and that first option could be, for example, global, or it could be all. Now, this global or all, this is passed to this use drop-down box, and this we have here in first option, and that first option could be used over here instead of hard coding all or global. So we can use it here as first option. That is one solution. If we look here, so now we can see that we have global here. We still have global over here. Another option could be that we just remove this option. We remove this fourth argument, and we do not pass the global or all over here. What we do is that our our drop-down hook is the same code, but we have just removed here the options. So we have this array of options that we get, and we map over it directly. But somehow we need to push in this array the first item, at index 0, global or all, or whatever is the first option that the user wants. So in order to do that, we can do it in our app.js file, or the calling function, the calling code. But this has made our hook general now. We don't have any hard-coded words. We don't have the first option as hard-coded like global or all or whatever the user wants. We don't have it. We can pass that option as the first option in this array of options at index 0. So let's do it here. So since we are getting a list of countries over here, so we can change this code like this here. Inside the function fetch countries from API, we can have a constant here, const countries, and we can move this code over here. This code is returning a promise, and when that promise is resolved, we will get a list of countries. Now we have an array of countries over here. What we do is that we push, but we don't use push, we use unshift, because push will insert it at the end of the array. We want to insert at the beginning of the array at index 0, and for that we use unshift. This is the function unshift, add items to the beginning of an array. For example, if we have an array, cats is Bob, what we do is cats unshift Willie. So Willie will be inserted before Bob. Now if insert Pop and George will be inserted before Willie and before Bob. So that is what we are going to use the function unshift, because we want to insert at index 0. What we do is here now that we insert here, we can insert all, or we can insert global here. And then we pass this countries, getting directly the list of countries. We are inserting at index 0, option global. And after that we pass it to our setter function, and now we have a country list where we have inserted at index 0 any arbitrary item that the caller of the code, the caller of the function, the caller of the drop-down maker wants to have as the first option. Here we are passing a country. So what we have to do is that we have to check for the country. If country is global, then get from API, pass an empty string. But if we have a country, then pass that country. So we have a special case here for global. If it is global, then we want to get data for all the countries. And we have written our function in such a way that if you pass the country, then you get data for that country. But if you don't pass a country, then you get data for all the countries, for the whole world, the data. So now we can see that we can change between the different countries over here, but we can go back to get data for the whole world. Thank you very much for watching this video.